Hey guys, Dr. Gerges here. I gave you a worksheet for part 1 of chapter 1, and it went through section 1.4 in your textbook. However, the narrated PowerPoint that I gave you only went through section 1.3. So I am making up for that by reviewing section 1.4 in this recorded narrated PowerPoint. And so this will go along with those questions on your worksheet that coincide to section 1.4. Now, this very first slide is simply a video from your textbook that reviews the hierarchy of life. So you just want to click on the play button for the video and go ahead and watch it. And it should help you to sort of visualize and see the hierarchy of life that we went over in the first PowerPoint that I narrated for you. So we reviewed the hierarchy of life from atoms all the way up to the biosphere on Earth. And the last slide just had you watch the video that was in your textbook, or goes along with your textbook. What I'm pointing out here is the concept of emergent properties. Emergent properties. So recognize the term and be able to explain what emergent properties means. So let me go over this for you. For any entity that's made up of smaller parts, when those parts are put together in a certain way, then you have a new thing, a new entity, and that new, bigger, more complex entity may have properties that arise, that come into existence by virtue of how those parts are working together. And that phenomenon of new properties or new characteristics arising when you put parts together to make a more complex thing, that is referred to as emergent properties. So in the hierarchy of organization of life, we see emergent properties everywhere. So for example, when tissues, let's say muscle cells, get put together into muscle tissue, you now have the emergent property that these cells can all work together and make an animal move. It's an emergent property. And you have a bunch of brain cells put together, nerve cells put together to make a brain. Well, at the level of just the individual nerve cells, they're not thinking, they don't have consciousness, they aren't able to respond to the environment in terribly complex ways, but you put them all together in a brain and they integrate and work together, then you now have the emergent property of maybe consciousness that humans have, awareness. You could even think about emergent properties of, say, a computer. Computers are made up of a central processing unit, a CPU, a motherboard, hard drive. You know, there's various components. You can scatter them around on a tabletop. You could pile them up, you know, into a mound. But if you put two of them together in a very specific way, then and turn on your computer, you now have something that can that can accomplish things that the individual parts couldn't do. You know, exactly what computers do: surf the internet, write papers, do art projects, all kinds of things. Cars, same deal, made up of a bunch of smaller parts, put them together in the right way, and voila, you have a driving machine. So again, back to our bodies, I put on this slide an image of a stomach. It's made up of different kinds of tissues, muscle, nerve, connective tissue, and they're all working together, and the stomach has emergent properties of being a pouch to store food. It has emergent properties of beginning to digest your food. So a lot of sort of higher order properties or processes that we talk about in biology, metabolism, consciousness, these are all emergent properties. there are 5 biological themes that help us to kind of focus in biology and understand what's going on. And so the study of life, biology, is organized around these general themes. So this is another part of chapter 1. Remember, chapter 1 that we're working on is kind of laying out, hey, this is biology, this is the big picture, this is what you need to be thinking about as we keep moving on. It kind of gives you a foundation. So these 5 themes are very important for you to learn, understand, think about, apply. So as we move on in biology, we can always be like referring back to which of the themes we're really working in or talking about. So let's go through those themes. I've got several slides set up here to help you understand them. So the first theme we're going to talk about, and in my opinion, it's maybe the most important theme, is evolution. And in fact, many biologists would argue that evolution is the unifying theme of biology. It helps us to understand all the facts and observations of biology. And without the theme of evolution, understanding of evolution, we'd be left empty, not understanding how things got this way, how things change, how species change, all kinds of examples, which I'll touch on a couple of them as we go through evolution. So evolution, very simply, is genetic change in a species over time. So we can watch evolution happen over time. Biologists have been documenting this for quite a while now. We can look at the fossil record and look at remains of dead organisms from the past, and we can document that kind of genetic change over time. So that's what evolution is. And the time frame that we're referring to is over generations, from one generation to the next. That the genetics of a population can change. So the time frame is over generations. So for humans, generations now run in, how on the average age of people reproducing, I don't know, maybe every 20 or 20 years old. So a generation time might be 20 years. Whereas in a population of birds, they might reach sexual maturity within a year, so a generation time would be a year. And so evolution would happen at a little faster pace for something that has a shorter generation time. For things like bacteria can reproduce and have a new generation maybe every hour. So very rapid generation turnover, and so opportunity for very rapid evolution. The mechanism for evolution, that is the primary thing that causes genetic change over generations, is a process, a mechanism called natural selection. This is a mechanism. It's a way that something happens. It's a way that evolution happens. And natural selection results in adaptation. All right, let me define what adaptations are. Adaptations are features, characteristics of organisms that give them a better chance at surviving and reproducing. That's what an adaptation is. So somewhere in the past of our human history, way before we were even humans, but we had an ancestor that was a primate. This was about 50 million years ago. And we can tell that, by the way, by the fossil record and also looking at DNA. But one of the characteristics that primates have, like monkeys and apes, is having grasping hands and feet. Okay, grasping hands and feet. Other mammals can't do this. A mouse can't do this. A shrew can't do this. So this is an adaptation. It's a feature characteristic that helps with grasping. And that helped our ancestors in the past with being tree-dwelling arboreal creatures. Of course, it helps us now for being able to be tool makers. Our brains are an adaptation for sensing the environment and responding. My stomach is an adaptation for storing and digesting food. So almost every aspect of our biology is an adaptation, something that was added on to our ancestors over hundreds of millions of years, because life and evolution goes way, 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 way back. Okay, now over long periods of time, this kind of adaptation from natural selection can lead to, like I've mentioned, lots of species of primates, like I show at the bottom of the slide, a little tree-like diagram showing how some of the major groups of primates are genetically related. Now look at the right-hand side of the slide. I've got a diagram I put in there from a different source, and it's showing you how natural selection works and how it results in evolution. So let me go over this with you quickly. Not that it needs to be quick, but it won't take long. So check it out. We've got a population of beetles. That's number one, step number one. And they're different colors. Some are kind of a light gray, some are a medium gray, some are a dark gray. And it's very important that that variation, differences among organisms, has a genetic basis. This is a requirement of natural selection. If there isn't genetic variation among organisms in a population, then natural selection won't happen. Okay? But most populations have lots of genetic variation. So there's raw material there for evolution. So let's get back to these beetles. There are different shades of gray, and that is caused by different genes, genetics. So along comes a bird and starts feasting on these beetles, and these beetles are on a dark background, so the lighter colored beetles show up to the bird more easily. You can see them more easily. So the bird is happily picking them up and eating them. And it's not seeing the dark colored beetles very well because they're blending in. So the dark beetles escape. They survive and they reproduce. They end up passing on their genetics. So this is step number 3. They pass on their genetics for the dark color that helped them survive. And when they do that, number 4, the next generation. So these beetles reproduce, they pass on their genetics for the darker color that helped them. And in the next generation, the population of beetles is overall darker. More of the beetles are a dark color. That's evolution. There was a genetic change in the population. And this genetic change was caused by natural selection. Some organisms surviving and reproducing more successfully than other ones because of the genetically based characteristic that they had. That's natural selection. It's very powerful. We'll come back to it in a little bit. So another underlying theme of biology that helps to give us focus on what we're studying and researching is the flow of energy. The flow of energy. Now, all living things require energy for doing things like growing, moving, even homeostasis, maintaining our internal environment takes energy. So this is a big theme. There isn't a living thing on this planet that does not require energy for doing these kinds of things. And energy flows through ecosystems. It flows from organism to organism as things get eaten. So organisms require energy, they take it up from their environment, and then the energy flows through. Now, ultimately, almost all the energy that life uses on Earth comes from our star that we call the sun. And as long as the sun is shining on Earth in our daytime hours, there is light energy that is coming down to the surface of our planet. And organisms like plants and algae, like seaweeds or little organisms in the water that make it look green, those are algae, they capture that light energy. And they go through the process of photosynthesis, which takes the light energy and turns it into chemical energy, putting it into molecules like sugars that are made through photosynthesis. So there is flow of energy right there. Energy is flowing from light into a plant. It's doing photosynthesis to make chemical energy. Then an animal like a caterpillar is on the plant and it's munching away and eating, like in the figure I have to the right. So it is acquiring energy from the food it's eating. The energy in the food is going into its body. And now that caterpillar can use some of that plant energy for growing and moving and reproducing and so on. Now, along the way, that energy is lost from organisms as well as heat. Just think about how hot you get when you're exercising. Your body produces heat as energy is being used, and that heat leaves your body. So ultimately, all of the energy that comes to our planet as light ends up leaving our planet as heat. This is the flow of energy. Another point I want to make on this slide when you look at this diagram that I included is chemical flow, chemical cycling, which is not part of this theme here. But as organisms are eating, like a caterpillar or a human, chemicals get passed on and they get recycled. When we eventually die, we decompose and molecules, chemicals go into the environment. Organisms can use them all over again. So matter, substance, is recycled over and over and over again. But energy flows through ecosystems and is eventually all lost as heat. So there's the theme of energy. So here's theme number 3. Cooperation. Life shows an amazing level of cooperation. Organisms are cooperating in diverse and dynamic ways. So, because energy and other resources, food, are limiting, they're not infinite, they can be hard to get, many organisms, many species have evolved cooperation as a means to survive. Not that they planned this. They don't sit around and debate and talk and say, hey, can we evolve together and cooperate more? It just happens. It happens because natural selection favors it. It was helped organisms survive and reproduce more effectively when certain organisms were cooperating, so that cooperation evolves. Now, symbiosis is a specific type of cooperation. Symbiosis is when two species live in direct contact, very intimately with each other. And we see symbioses all over the place in nature. Take a look at the photo I have on the bottom left, the hummingbird and the butterfly feeding on the flower, the nectar and the pollen and the flower. And there's cooperation going on there, and specifically, it's symbiosis. These creatures are living in direct contact. Why does this happen? Why did it evolve? How is it beneficial? Well, while the hummingbird and the butterfly are getting food from the flowers, which helps them out, The hummingbird and the butterfly are spreading the pollen from flower to flower and helping the plants to reproduce. So giving the plants a better chance to reproduce by spreading their pollen around. So it helps them all out. That's symbiosis. Take a look in the bottom right of the slide. There are many different bacteria that live in our intestines. Indeed, there's like over 100 species that live in your mouth. But there are many, many, many different types that live in your intestines. And not only are they symbiotic with us, they're living in direct contact with us, but they're living in direct contact with each other too. And they're doing different kinds of things. And by doing different kinds of things, they help each other. So cooperation is rampant in biology. The fourth theme is structure determines function. Structure determines function. This one should be fairly intuitive because you encounter this all the time in everyday life. So let me give you just some examples. Everyday life, utensils in your kitchen come in many different shapes. And those different shapes, those different structures determine how the utensil is going to work. You open up your silverware drawer, you might have a spoon in there, a knife in there, a fork in there. Each one of them has a different structure, and that determines how they work, their function. So knife, cutting, spoon, scooping, fork, stabbing, structure determines function. We could go on and on and on with examples in the kitchen and the garage, examples with cars. Hey, fast-moving cars have a different structure than a slow-moving car. Now we come back to evolution. It's such an important theme. So evolution favors structures that function in an adaptive manner. So, hey, come back to my grasping hands, right? So structure determines function. The structure of my hand and the bones and the muscles determine that I'm able to grasp with it. So, of course, many structures are specialized for a very particular function, almost all over the place. So take a look on the bottom, bird wings. We know wings of birds help them fly. Well, that's largely because of the structure of the wing. The shape of the wing helps the bird get lifted up in the air, so its structure enables that. When we look at the bones that make up a wing, the bones are hollow to some degree. I have a photo down there showing you that, kind of honeycombed. So this makes the bones very lightweight, they don't weigh as much, but still very strong. So structure determines function. Look on the bottom right of the slide. I put an image of a nerve cell. So the shape or the structure of a nerve cell is adapted, if you will, to communicating. That's what nerve cells do. They communicate with other nerve cells. So structure determines function. Our last theme in section 1.4 is homeostasis. So homeostasis is a physiological condition. It's a condition of our internal chemistry, that's physiology, and it's a physiological condition of steady state, like keeping things in balance, like homeostasis, keeping or staying in balance. So the internal environment of organisms, of living things, is pretty stable, doesn't change very much. So the organism is working on homeostasis, keeping it stable, because otherwise, if the physiological condition, the chemistry inside the organism starts changing very much, that could kill the organism. Everything is humming along and fine-tuned very specifically. So organisms act to control their internal environments, their homeostasis, so that complex processes of metabolism can function efficiently. So this is why you got to spend multiple semesters learning about human biology, etc., because we're so complex. There are so many intricate details of how we work that you're having to take a lot of time to learn about all of them, and many of these processes are involved in our homeostasis. Let's take, for example, what I put on the bottom right of the slide. In your body, after you ingest or eat food and digest it, the sugars from your food go into your blood. And the sugar is called glucose. Glucose is a type of sugar. Well, if you have too much sugar in your blood, that can be very harmful and damaging to your body. So you have to keep your sugar amounts in balance. There has to be a homeostasis of your sugar concentrations. So your pancreas, one of your organs in your body, the cells of your pancreas, release a hormone called insulin. And the job of insulin, its one and only job, is to help keep your sugar levels in your blood balanced, to help keep a homeostasis of your sugars in your blood so that the sugars don't get too low or too high. So this is just a specific example of homeostasis. And you should be able to refer to an example like this to demonstrate that you understand. So know what homeostasis means and why it's important, and be able to give an example like this as a starting point.